Hey friends, Steve Guttenberg here. This is the Audiophiliac Daily Show, and today we're going to talk about changes. So, I hear from a lot of audiophiles who are looking to upgrade, right? They want to get something better, but the catch is they don't have enough money to really do an upgrade from something really good to something really great. They don't have the budget for it right now, and I get it. But they make an upgrade that's sort of a sideways move instead of a vertical move, right? They get something that's kind of like what they already have, just a little different. They go from a Polk speaker to a Golden Ear Technology speaker, something like that. They go from something to something else that's sort of the same as what they already have. That's kind of a waste of time. What you need to do is, if you can't go up, if you're going to go sideways in terms of your budget, get something that's very different than what you already have, right? So, one thing that you might investigate is vintage. That's one thing. Now, I did the Macintosh C22 preamp the other day. It's very expensive. It's a $6,000 preamp. But you could get let's say, a vintage preamp that's much closer to your budget, that's about the same price as something you already own, but is very different. Like, you could go from what you have to a 1980s or 1990s vintage preamp, for example. Or if you have, $1,000 speaker, you could get another $1,000 speaker, but one that's the opposite. Let's say you have a box speaker, a dynamic speaker, you could get a used Magnapan speaker, or an electrostatic speaker, or an omnidirectional speaker. Any of those will sound hugely different than your box speaker that you currently are listening to it, right? And you could spend some time. I'll spend a couple of weeks listening to my box speaker, to my to my Buckhart speaker, and then I'll spend a couple of weeks listening to my Maggie, and I'll spend a couple of weeks listening to my omnidirectional speaker. And by the way, the Ohm omnidirectional speakers are cool because they can go right up against a wall, unlike a lot of high-end speakers that need some breathing room around them. Ohms can be right up against a wall. But my point here is, whatever your budget is, instead of thinking about you got to spend more and more and more, spend the same but get something that's extremely different than what you already own. If you're only into digital, get a turntable. Get a decent turntable with a decent cartridge, and just settle it and listen to how different music sounds coming from a turntable. Or if you're really just a turntable person and you've barely listened to any digital, won't kill you. Get a decent CD player. They're, not hard to find now. There's lots of them on the market. Used ones. If you buy from a good seller on eBay or from a store that sells used gear, it's worth it. CDs are cheap. CD players are cheap. Just go in there and look for the music. I mean, people are throwing away their CDs. You can find them on the street sometimes, right? But again, I want you to consider the opposite of what you already have. One thing that struck me is, what about getting a vintage 1970s, 1980s, maybe even 1990s stereo receiver? They do not sound like modern receivers, especially ones from the 70s and 80s. Solid state I'm talking about here, right? They just do a thing. And by the way, they look so cool. All those knobs and buttons and everything. They're just the coolest. That's why people were nutso about them in their day. Is every year they just had this fresh new crop of cool looking stuff. So there's lots of them out there, and just to get in touch with what music sounded like in the days before the internet and all these distractions we have now, when everybody who was into music had a decent stereo of some sort, and almost always with a receiver. The people who weren't audiophiles at the time, everybody had receivers. Your mom had a receiver. Everybody had receivers. So dipping your toe into that sound of 70s and 80s and 1990s stereo receivers, it's definitely worth checking out. Of course, if you want to get really into it and go, vintage 1970s or 60s tube electronics, that's a whole other thing. Now, of course, those need a little more care and feeding and may need to be recapped and gone over and restored. But that sound is gigantically different. That is so, at its best, rich, bold, technicolor, juicy, fat, just this scrumptious sound that we had back in the day, that as the decades passed, the trend towards more accurate, more neutral, more transparent, that just kept moving forward. And when you listen to the old stuff, it definitely sounds, as we used to say, colored. But colored in a very musically engaging way. So yes, looking for Conrad, Johnson, Audio Research, Vacuum Tube Logic, VTL, VAC, so many great tube electronics of that period that they're out there. Check eBay, check Audiogon, check your local listings, whatever. Just keep looking around. You'll find something sweet. Buying from a seller that has a good track record or a store is, with vintage stuff, absolutely required, right? If you don't, all bets are off. Anything and could go wrong, and probably will. So be careful about who you buy vintage gear from. Now, if you really want to hear different, without spending crazy money, get into headphones. Audeze LCD series headphones, Hi-Fi Man HE series headphones, Dan Clark Audio, which used to be Mr. Speakers, Grado headphones. My Grado RS1 headphones are about 20 years old. Those, in some ways, those are my favorite Grados of all time. But I do have a new Grado that's really, really interesting. I'll tell you about that real soon. But headphones compared to speakers, well, yeah, some would say the sound is in your head, but the sound eliminates the room. All of your room problems are gone. They're finished. They're just banished. You put on those headphones and your room is disappears. So forget about room treatment. The ultimate room treatment is no room. Put on headphones and you have a direct connection between the music and you. It doesn't get tighter than that. Now, of course, some say the sound is stuck in your head, and I've heard that complaint a gazillion times. And it can be with not the best headphones. But with good headphones, with decent electronics, and if you don't have a headphone amp, and you probably don't if you're getting into this, the Schiit Asgard 3 is about $200. Really, really nice. It's a great starter headphone amp. But the point here is, listening to headphones is such a different experience than speakers. In some ways better, because you've eliminated the room. In some ways not the equal of speakers in terms of dynamic impact and bass, oomph, and that sort of thing. No, headphones aren't going to give you that. But in terms of hearing what's going on in the music, hearing the mix, hearing subtle details that were lost before by the sound of your room was obscuring the sound that was actually in the recording. If you've never done it, it's absolutely worth a try to make a serious attempt to getting into headphones and understanding what all the fuss is about, because it's a real thing. And I'm not saying the headphones are going to replace your speakers as your primary source, just that it's very gratifying, very satisfying to hear familiar music in a completely different way over a set of very decent headphones. So one thing I didn't mention about buying vintage gear is the feel of it is very different, or can be very different than most modern gear. Because in the days before remote controls, meaning the 70s and 80s, and well, for a lot of high-end companies, even into the 2000s, they don't all necessarily have remote controls. So when these companies were making products that people had to physically touch all the time to use them, they put more emphasis on what those controls felt like in your hand, the feel of the knob, how it felt when you turned it, when there were switches, what the switches felt like when you turned them on and off. It was a sensual experience that is completely lost by listening to, with today's electronics that are all basically remote control based. So you buy a decent 1960s, 70s, 80s high-end audio piece, and the feel of it is satisfying in its own way, beyond what it sounds like. The look and feel, and even the build quality, because they knew in those days that the owners would be physically engaged with the gear in ways that people aren't anymore. So you get the gist. And of course, I almost forgot to leave out, if you're a digital guy, get into vinyl. If you're a vinyl only guy, get into digital. You know, you gotta try the opposite of where you're at now. That's the point. So don't always think about spending more and more and more to get a better and better speaker or amplifier or cable or whatever. Think about difference. Think about getting something that's the opposite of what you already have, or at least very different than what you already have. Subwoofers. You know, I don't care how big your speakers are. They don't have bass like a good subwoofer does, like a REL subwoofer or a JL subwoofer. Those deep bass penetration is far beyond almost any, you know, tower speaker or certainly bookshelf speaker. And when you add a sub, again, it isn't a subtle change. It's a big change. And if you're into music that has bass, and even if bass isn't even your primary goal, you will hear substantial, you get it, substantial differences when you add a sub. And not just in bass, you will hear differences in imaging. I know it doesn't seem like you would, but if you've never lived with a good sub, you don't know that. You don't know what you're missing in terms of depth and space in recordings, good recordings, that you will hear when you add a subwoofer to your system. So again, a change. Don't buy if you already have a $1,500 preamp, don't buy another $1,500 preamp that's kind of like what you already have, just a little different. Get a $1,500 subwoofer and you will be floored by the difference. It takes time to set up. It's a kind of a hassle. But believe me, if you've never lived with it, if you've never experienced what a sub can do, there's a way to put your money in that's not a sideways move, not in the slightest. My name's Steve Guttenberg. This is the Audiophiliac Daily Show. Right now, coming to you 4 or 5 days a week. If you dig it, please subscribe. If you already have subscribed, thank you for subscribing. But if you're new to this, if you just stumbled upon this show right now, thank you for being here. But when you subscribe, you got to hit that little notification bell. That little icon of a bell pops up, and click on that, and then you'll be notified. If you just subscribe and don't hit the bell, well, you'll miss out. You won't know when there's a new episode. So anyway, check that out. Then there's the Patreon. You know about the Patreon, right? The Patreon can be found at patreon.com/Audiophiliac. And if you can't write that down fast enough, I got you covered. It's in the description directly below this video. There's playlists here for speaker reviews and headphone reviews and electronics reviews and even music reviews. People seem to really like the music reviews, so check those out. There's also playlists for interviews with just all kinds, so many fascinating people that have graced this spot, this channel. I can't thank those people enough for coming here and spending some time with me. So I think my work here is at last complete. I hope to see you back here again very, very soon. Bye-bye.